The first sign was the absence of sound. The old lion lay beneath the acacia, and for the first time in his life, the grass around him held no weight of waiting, no cubs hidden in the thicket, no lionesses resting in the shade of his presence. He was alone, and the quiet told him everything. His mane had thinned over the dry seasons, the dark gold fading to a pale ash along his shoulders. The scars on his muzzle had deepened into furrows, each one a record of a fight he had won. But the body underneath had begun to change. The forelegs that once drove rivals into the dust now trembled slightly when he rose. The breath came slower. The pride still ate when he killed, but the killing took longer now. He had ruled this territory for years, long enough that the boundaries were written into his bones, every ridge and waterhole and sleeping tree mapped in muscle memory. The lionesses knew his pace. The cubs knew his shadow. When he walked the eastern edge at dawn, the younger males in the neighboring lands heard his roar and answered with silence. That silence was respect. It was also a measure of what he had been, but the pride had grown quiet in a way he could not read. The lionesses still groomed him at dusk. The cubs still tumbled over his paws. Yet something in the rhythm had shifted. A small dislocation he felt but could not name. He was slower to rise. He slept deeper in the heat of the day, and the males at the border had begun to test, their roars coming closer with each passing week. No single moment announced the change. It arrived the way drought arrives, a gradual tightening, a slow subtraction of what had once been abundant. The old lion still patrols, still marks the trees, still answers the night with a roar that carries across the plain. But the patrols are shorter now, and the roar, when it comes, is answered not with silence, but with a distant challenge, young and confident and closing in. What the old lion does not know, as he lies beneath the acacia and watches the heat shimmer rise from the grass, is that the challenge has already been issued. Two males, brothers from the marsh pride, have been watching his borders for weeks. They have counted his age in the weight of his footprint. They have measured his weakness in the length of his silence, and they have made their decision. The old king is still breathing, but his rule has already entered its final days. The brothers had not come for territory alone. Territories change hands through the slow arithmetic of age, and they had read the old lion's numbers with patience. What they wanted was more permanent. They wanted the bloodline, every cub carrying his blood, every female carrying his future. In the calculus of the savanna, a pride is not land. A pride is progeny. For 3 nights they circled the eastern boundary, staying downwind, keeping to the dry riverbed where their scent would not carry. The old lion's roar still rolled across the plain at dusk, but the brothers listened to what the sound had become. Once it had been a wall. Now it was a warning that carried a tremble at its end, a fraction of a second where the voice caught before the final drop. They heard it. They moved closer. The lionesses felt the change before the old king did. They stopped sleeping in the open. The cubs, who had known only the security of the pride's center, were gathered earlier in the evening and kept tighter to the thicket. One of the younger females began scanning the horizon with a stillness that belonged to prey, not predator. The old lion noticed her watching. He did not know what she saw. On the 4th morning, the brothers stepped into the open. They came not at a run, but at a walk, side by side, shoulders level, the deliberate pace of animals that have already won and are simply confirming the result. The first was darker, heavier through the chest, his mane streaked with the red dust of the riverbed. The second was leaner, faster, the one who would drive and harry while his brother held the line. 2 of them. The old king had faced many single challenges in his years. He had never faced 2 who moved as one. The pride's reaction was immediate and wordless. The females rose, turned, and began moving the cubs toward the far ridge, not running, not panicking, but with the practiced urgency of a herd that knows the storm is coming. The old lion rose too. He did not advance. He stood at the edge of his territory and watched the brothers approach, and for a long moment, the 3 of them held the plain in a tension so complete that even the birds stopped calling. What happened next was not a battle in the way the old lion had known battles. It was a calculation. The brothers split, one circling left toward the thicket where the cubs had been, the other advancing straight at the old king with his head low. The old lion's body remembered the response. The explosive charge, the bite to the throat, the shove that sent challengers tumbling. But the body that remembered was not the body that answered. His hindquarters failed to drive. The ground slipped beneath his back paws, and in that half-second of hesitation, the leaner brother hit him from the side. The fight was short and terrible in its efficiency. The old lion fought with everything he had left, and everything he had left was not enough. The darker brother closed on his throat, and the old lion twisted free, but the twist cost him a hind leg, and the weight of two younger males pinned him to the grass. He did not die there. The brothers did not kill him. That was not their purpose. They drove him out instead, with bites to the haunches and the base of the tail, herding him eastward across the boundary stones, past the acacia where his shadow had lain for years, into the scrubland beyond. The last thing he saw as he limped away was the thicker brother turning back toward the pride, and the leaner one following, and the cubs being gathered into a tight, silent knot under the thorn trees. He stopped once at the crest of the ridge and looked back. The lionesses were not looking at him. They were looking at the brothers, and in that gaze, the old king understood what the brothers had come for. The old lion's last view was already the brothers' inheritance, and the pride's silence completed the transfer before he crossed the ridge. For those who would rather watch these ledgers of succession as they are recorded than hear them explained, subscribe, and the next entry will be waiting. If you recognize the exact moment the old king understood what the brothers had come for, leave the word ridge in the comments. He could not have stopped them. That is the part that is difficult to watch. Not the violence itself, but the sheer physical impossibility of it. A body that has given decades to the pride cannot be summoned for one final effort when the debt is already overdue. The old lion's muscles remembered the fights they had won. They no longer had the fuel to repeat them. He lay down in the scrub that night, alone, and the blood from his haunches dried into the dust. And somewhere behind him, in the territory he had guarded, the sounds of the pride changed. The roars that rose from the thicket were not his own. He listened to the unfamiliar voices through the dark. The brothers had not rested. They were moving through the pride's heart, and he could track them by the distress of the cubs, the sudden scattered panic, the silence of the lionesses who had no way to resist and no place to flee. He knew what was happening. Every old male in the savanna knows what happens when a coalition takes over, but knowing had never required him to feel it, and feeling had never required him to survive it. He lay still and listened, and the night stretched into hours that carried no mercy. By dawn, the territory was no longer his. The brothers had marked the eastern trees, the Waterhole, the sleeping ridge. Their scent lay over everything like a new season. The old king could have turned and fought again. There is always the option of a final futile charge that ends a life with meaning attached to it. He did not take it. He rose instead, slowly, favoring his injured hind leg, and began to walk. Not toward the pride, away from it, into the long grass where the lions of his age go when the story they have carried for so long finally closes. The walking did not hurt the way he expected. There was a numbness in the early days, a drift of the mind that made the distance bearable. He crossed the dry riverbed where the brothers had waited, and he did not look back at it. He found water in a shallow pan that had not yet evaporated, and he drank without the usual vigilance because there was nothing left to guard. The plain received him the way it receives all exiles, without judgment, without welcome, simply as another body moving through the heat. The days passed in a rhythm of hunger and shade. His injured leg healed slowly, badly, the scar tissue pulling tight over the muscle. He caught a young wildebeest that had strayed from its herd, and the kill took him longer than it once had, and he ate alone with the carcass in the open, too tired to drag it into cover. The vultures gathered at a distance, patient, knowing that this particular lion was now closer to their kind than to his own. It was on the 6th day that he stopped walking and stood still, and the direction of his gaze turned back toward the territory he had left, not out of longing. Exile does not produce longing in a lion. It produces a slow, grinding awareness of the arithmetic that has gone wrong. The pride was no longer his. The cubs were no longer his. But the body that had carried him through so many seasons had never learned the lesson of giving up. It had only learned to endure. And endurance in the old lion's world was not a choice. It was the only language he had ever spoken. He began the walk back that evening, not as a king returning to his throne, but as a survivor returning to the place where survival had once had meaning. The territory was still his, in the only way that mattered to him. It was the ground his body knew, the ridges he had marked, the waterholes he had defended. The brothers had taken the pride. They had not taken the land, and the old lion, walking slowly through the gathering dark, was heading home to the only thing he had left. The brothers found the cubs within the first 2 days. That is the part of the story that has no softening, no alternative reading, no way to look away. The old king had fathered them, guarded them, taught them the small lessons of hiding and waiting. The brothers killed them one by one, quickly, without cruelty and without hesitation, the way all new coalitions kill the offspring of the males they have displaced. It was not malice. It was arithmetic, the cold, efficient arithmetic of the savanna, where a bloodline that carries an old king's blood cannot be allowed to grow. The lionesses watched. They did not intervene. They could not, and they knew it. In the weeks that followed, they would come into estrus again, and the brothers would father a new generation, and the pride would continue under new names and new roars. That is the way of the savanna. The old king's blood would live on nowhere but in the memory of his own body, and in the long grass that had witnessed his reign. The lionesses grieved in their way, which is not a human way. They lay apart, they ate less. They watched the brothers with an unreadable stillness. And then, as the seasons turned, they returned to the rhythm of the pride. The old king, walking back through the scrub, did not know the cubs were dead. The distance was too great. The wind carried nothing, and he had no way to read the territory's news from this far out. But he felt something change in the air as he crossed into the land he once ruled. The scent marks on the boundary trees were new. The grass along the ridge had been trodden by different paws. And the silence was different now. Not the waiting quiet of a pride resting under his protection, but the taut, watchful quiet of a territory holding its breath for something it knew was coming. He stopped at the crest of the eastern ridge, the same ridge where he had once stood at dawn and felt the weight of his own power. Below him, the plain spread out in the familiar pattern of grass and thorn and distant water. He could see the acacia where he had lain in the heat. He could see the thicket where the cubs had hidden, and he could see the brothers, 2 dark shapes moving through the tall grass at the edge of the territory, patrolling the borders he had walked for so many years. They had not seen him yet. The wind was in his favor. The late light threw his shadow long behind him, and for a moment, standing on the ridge in the fading sun, the old lion looked like what he had once been. The brothers were not looking at him. That was the detail that mattered. They were patrolling with the confidence of males who have won, and winning has made them careless in a way the old lion recognized from his own youth. He had been careless once too, in the years before the scars taught him caution. He had walked the borders without checking the wind, without scanning the long grass, without reading the ground for the signs of another predator. The brothers were young. They had forgotten that the savanna is never truly won. It is only held for as long as the holder can hold it. The old lion did not charge. He did not roar. He stood on the ridge and watched them, and in his watching there was something that was not anger and not sadness, but something older and harder to name, a recognition of the way the world turns. He had been the challenger once. He had driven an older male out of this very territory years ago, and watched him limp into the scrub without looking back. The cycle was not a cruelty, it was a wheel, and the wheel had turned, and now he was the one on the ground looking up at the riders. But the wheel had not finished with him. That is the thing the brothers had not counted on. They had measured his age, his weight, his silence. They had not measured the thing that had kept him alive through every challenge, every drought, every failed hunt, the refusal of a body that has known only one purpose: to surrender it entirely. The old lion took a step down the ridge, then another. He did not hurry. He moved with the deliberate care of a hunter who has learned that speed is wasted where patience will do, and he angled his path not toward the brothers, but toward the waterhole, where the pride would come to drink at dusk. The lionesses saw him first. They were gathered at the edge of the water, heads lowered, the late light catching their coats. One of them raised her head and stilled, and the others followed her gaze, and for a long moment, the pride stood frozen, watching the shape that moved down the ridge toward them. The old lion did not stop. He did not quicken. He walked through the grass with his head level, his scarred muzzle catching the wind, and the lionesses parted without a sound to let him reach the water's edge. The lionesses did not block him. They opened a line to the water and held it. Subscribe if you want to keep watching what the long lens sees, the moments that pass without narration telling you what they mean. Comment, the water's edge, if you saw what the pride did before the old lion drank. He drank. The water was cool and carried the taste of the territory he had guarded, and he drank long and deep, the way he had drunk 1,000 times before in this same place. The brothers had not yet seen him. They were still patrolling the eastern edge, their attention fixed on the distance, on the imagined threats that had taken the place of the real one approaching from the other side. And the old lion, lifting his head from the water with the droplets falling from his chin, began to roar. It was not the roar of his youth, the vast, commanding sound that had rolled across the plain and silenced every voice within hearing. It was thinner, cracked at the edges, a voice that had been used too many times and not rested enough. But it carried the same intention. It said, in the only language the savanna knows, that this ground had a history and that history was not finished. The brothers stopped. They turned, and across the distance, through the failing light, they saw the old king standing at the waterhole, his mane pale against the darkening grass, and they understood that the story they had thought closed was still open. The brothers did not charge immediately. They stood at the eastern edge and measured what they saw, a lion who should have been too old, too broken, too far gone to matter. But there was something in the way he stood that gave them pause. Not the body. The body was clearly failing. It was the place he had chosen to stand. The waterhole was the heart of the territory, and a male who returns to the heart, after everything has been taken from him, is not a male who has given up. He is a male who has made a decision. The old lion watched them watch him. He did not advance toward them, and he did not retreat. He stood at the water's edge with his flanks heaving from the effort of the walk and the roar, and he let the silence stretch between them. The lionesses had moved to the far side of the waterhole, a ring of watching eyes. The cubs, the new cubs, the brothers' cubs, were hidden in the thicket. And in that long, still moment, the three lions held the plain in a balance that could tip in any direction. What broke the balance was not a charge. It was a sound, a low, rumbling growl from the darker of the two brothers, a sound that carried frustration and calculation in equal measure. He had not expected this. He had expected a broken lion limping into the distance, not a broken lion standing at the waterhole with his head up and his gaze level. The leaner brother shifted his weight, ready to move, but the darker one held him back with a single glance. They were learning, in that moment, what the old king had learned over decades. The savanna rewards patience and punishes the rush. The old lion turned his head slowly, scanning the plain with the unhurried confidence of a male who has nothing left to lose. He looked at the ridge where he had once stood at dawn. He looked at the acacia where his shadow had lain. He looked at the thicket where the cubs, his cubs, the ones with his blood, had hidden, and he did not know they were gone, and he did not need to know. The eyes that came back to the brothers carried no fear. They carried only the flat, patient weight of a decision already made. He did not move toward them. That was the final lesson, the one the brothers would remember long after this night. The old king did not need to drive them out on the first evening of his return. He needed only to stand at the waterhole and drink the water and roar and wait. The territory had witnessed his reign. It would witness his return, and the brothers, standing at the eastern edge with their new kingdom stretching behind them, had to decide what the return of the old king meant for the kingdom they had only just claimed. They decided in the end to wait as well. They had won the pride by patience and calculation. They would not throw it away on a nighttime charge at a lion who had nothing left to protect. They withdrew into the tall grass on the eastern edge, keeping the pride between themselves and the old king, and the plain settled into a new, watchful silence, a silence that held not one king but two claims, and the memory of a bloodline that the seasons had already taken. The old lion lowered his head to the water again, drank, and did not look at the brothers again. He had returned. He had stood at the heart of the territory and been seen by the pride. The long walk back, the exile, the wounds, the slow arithmetic of survival, all of it had led to this single, quiet act of standing where he had once stood, with the water at his feet and the plain in his nostrils, and the night coming on. He did not know if the brothers would come for him before dawn. He did not know if the lionesses would still accept him. He knew only that he was here, and that the ground beneath his paws was the ground he had guarded, and that for this one long moment, the old king was not done. The night passed without violence. The brothers held the eastern edge, and the old king held the waterhole, and between them lay a stretch of grass that neither crossed. The lionesses settled in the thicket with the new cubs, their eyes moving between the two claims on their loyalty, waiting, as the savanna always waits, for the dawn to reveal what the dark had hidden. When the first light came, it came grey and cold, the way it comes after a long night. The old king had not slept. He stood where he had stood the evening before, his head low, his breath visible in the morning air. The brothers were still there, darker shapes in the tall grass, watching. No one had moved. No one had won. The territory lay under the new light like a held breath, and the old lion, his body screaming from the walk and the wounds and the long vigil, understood that this was not a battle to be won in a single morning. He had learned something in the years of his rule that the brothers had not yet learned. A territory is not held by force alone. It is held by presence, by the simple, unbroken fact of being there, day after day, until the ground itself remembers you. The brothers had the strength to take the pride. They did not yet have the patience to hold it against the weight of memory. And the old king, standing at the waterhole with his thin mane lifting in the wind, was memory made flesh. The pride began to move as the sun rose. The lionesses rose from the thicket, stretched, and began the slow drift toward the water. They did not approach the old king directly. They approached the water's edge at a distance, heads lowered, eyes flicking between him and the brothers. But they came. That was the detail the old lion noted, the detail that mattered more than any roar. They could have chosen the brothers' side entirely. They did not. They came to the water and they drank, and they did not flinch when his shadow fell across them. The brothers watched this from the eastern edge, and the calculation in their eyes shifted. They had killed the old king's cubs. They had taken his lionesses. They had driven him into exile. But they had not reckoned on the loyalty that outlasts a reign. The quiet, unspoken allegiance of females who remember which male guarded the waterhole through the worst of the drought, which male brought down the kill when the herds were thin. The old king did not move to reclaim them. He did not need to. They had made their choice in the small, wordless acts of the morning. By midday, the standoff had settled into something like a rhythm. The old king lay at the waterhole's edge, his injured legs stretched out before him, his head resting on his paws. The brothers patrolled the eastern boundary, but their patrols had grown shorter, their confidence less certain. They had expected a broken lion to fade into the distance. They had not expected a broken lion to become a fixture, a presence, a claim that could not be ignored. And the longer he stayed, the more the territory itself seemed to accept him back into its pattern. The old king did not hunt that day. He did not need to. The vultures that had followed him through the exile now circled at a greater distance, their patience running thin, their hope of an easy meal fading with each hour he remained upright. He drank when the water was cool, he rested when the heat peaked, and he watched the brothers with the flat, patient gaze of a male who has already survived everything they could do to him. There was no fear in that gaze. There was no anger either. There was only the terrible, unshakable calm of a creature that has accepted the terms of its own life. On the second morning, the brothers made their first move. The leaner one approached the waterhole alone, head low, shoulders rolling with the deliberate threat of a male asserting dominance. He came within sight of the old king and stopped, and for a long moment the two males held each other's gaze across the grass. The old king did not rise. He did not lower his head. He simply lay there, watching, and the leaner brother, after a long moment, turned and walked back to the eastern edge. He had been testing. He had found nothing to test against. The old king had not even deigned to stand. It was on the third evening that something shifted in the pride's behavior. The lionesses began to settle nearer to the old king's position, their resting spots creeping closer to the waterhole with each passing night. The new cubs, the brothers' cubs, had begun to venture out of the thicket, and one of them, bolder than the rest, had wandered within a few paces of where the old king lay. The lionesses watched, but did not call it back. The old king watched too, his head lifting slightly, his nostrils flaring at the scent of the cub that carried no trace of his blood. He did not move toward it. He did not move away. He simply lay there, and the cub, after a moment of curiosity, turned and bounded back to the thicket. The brothers saw this. They saw the cub approach the old king and return unharmed, and they read in that exchange something that chilled them more than any threat. The old king was not a threat to the cubs. He was not a threat to them. He was something more dangerous, a presence that the pride was learning to accept again, a memory that was slowly becoming a fact. And in the savanna, a fact is harder to kill than a rival. The old king had not yet decided what he wanted from this return. He had not planned it. He had walked back because the body that carried him had never learned to stop, and he had stood at the Waterhole because it was the only ground he had ever truly known. The brothers saw a challenge. The lionesses saw a guardian. The cubs saw a large, still shape that smelled of age and dust. And the old king himself, lying at the water's edge with the night coming on again, saw only the plain and the water and the long grass where his story had been written and rewritten. And he understood that this was not a homecoming and not a war. It was a continuation. That was not a homecoming and not a war. It was a continuation, and the cub walking away unharmed is the only verdict the Waterhole has given. Subscribe to keep following the old king as this continuation becomes a fact the brothers cannot undo. Leave the word continuation in the comments if you read that moment the same way, or write what you saw in the cub's curiosity before it bounded back. He had returned to a pride that was no longer his, with a body that was no longer strong, in a territory that had already been claimed by the two brothers who had taken everything from him. And yet he had returned, and he was still standing. The brothers had taken his pride, his cubs, his youth. They had not taken the one thing that had kept him alive through every exile and every wound. The simple, stubborn fact of being alive and being present and refusing to disappear. The Waterhole became the center of his world. He drank from it at dawn and at dusk. He lay beside it through the heat of the day, and he watched the pride move around him with the detached attention of an old male who no longer needs to prove anything. The brothers still patrolled the eastern edge, but their patrols had become routine, their aggression tempered by the realization that the old king was not going to leave. The lionesses had grown accustomed to his presence. The cubs had grown curious, and the plain, which had held its breath for so long, had begun to settle into a new pattern, one that included the old king not as a conqueror, but as a piece of the territory itself. The seasons turned slowly in the savanna, and the old king turned with them. The rains came, and the grass grew thick and green, and the Waterhole swelled beyond its banks. The brothers fathered new cubs, and the pride grew, and the old king remained at the Waterhole like a landmark, a fixed point in a changing landscape. He was thinner now, his ribs visible through his coat, his mane reduced to a thin fringe along his neck. He hunted rarely, and when he did, he ate alone, the vultures gathering at a respectful distance to watch the slow, deliberate process of an old predator finishing his meal. The lionesses still brought him nothing. They did not need to. He was no longer their provider, but they allowed him to remain, and in the savanna, permission to remain is the highest form of acceptance. The old king had not reclaimed his territory. He had not reclaimed his pride. He had reclaimed something smaller and more essential, a place in the pattern, a shape in the long grass, a name that the wind still carried. He was lying at the Waterhole one evening, watching the sun sink below the ridge, when the two brothers came to drink. They approached the water's edge together, as they always did, their heads low, their eyes scanning the plain. They saw the old king lying there, and they stopped. For a long moment, the three lions stood in the fading light, the water between them, and the old king raised his head and met their gaze. They did not charge. They did not growl. They lowered their heads to the water and drank, and the old king watched them, and then he lowered his head too, and the three of them drank from the same Waterhole in the same evening. The two brothers and the old king, bound together by the territory they shared and the history they could not escape. The rain had come and gone, and the grass along the ridge had grown tall and golden. The old king was thinner now, his movements slower, his eyes clouded with the film of great age. He did not hunt anymore. He did not patrol. He lay at the Waterhole through the long afternoons, watching the pride move around him. And the brothers had stopped patrolling the eastern edge, with the same vigilance they had once brought to it. They had learned to live with the old king's presence, to drink from the same water, to walk the same paths. The territory had absorbed them all into its pattern. The two brothers, who had taken the pride with such ruthless efficiency, had grown into their rule. They had fathered cubs, defended the borders, held the territory against the younger males who came to test them. They had become what the old king had once been. And the old king, lying at the waterhole, watched them with the flat, patient gaze of a male who has seen the wheel turn many times and knows it does not stop for anyone. The end came quietly, the way it comes for all old males. The old king lay at the waterhole on an afternoon when the heat hung heavy over the plain, and he did not rise when the sun began to sink. The lionesses noticed first. They gathered at a distance, watching, their heads lowered. The brothers came too, and they stood at the eastern edge and watched the old king, and they did not approach him. The vultures, which had followed him for so long, gathered in the trees at the edge of the territory, patient as ever. He was not breathing. That was the first thing they noticed. The old king lay still, his head resting on his paws, his body arranged as if he had simply fallen asleep in the middle of a long watch. The waterhole rippled in the evening breeze, and the grass rustled, and the plain went on around him, indifferent and eternal. The two brothers stood at the eastern edge for a long time, looking at the shape of the male who had once been the king of this ground, and then they turned and walked back into the tall grass, and the pride settled into the rhythm of the evening. The old king was not buried. The savanna does not bury its own. The vultures came down from the trees, and the hyenas came from the shadows, and the bones that had carried him through so many seasons were scattered across the grass, bleached by the sun and picked clean by the wind. The waterhole remained. The territory remained. The pride remained under the rule of the two brothers who had taken it so many seasons ago, and the long grass grew over the place where the old king had lain, and the story of his return became one of the many stories the savanna keeps and does not tell. The two brothers still hold the territory, their roars rolling across the plain at dusk, their cubs growing in the thicket. The lionesses still gather at the waterhole, and the water still rises and falls with the seasons. And the old king, who returned to the only ground he had ever known, lies now in the long grass, part of the earth he guarded for so long, part of the memory the territory carries in its bones. Two males came for him. They took his pride, his cubs, his youth. They drove him into exile and left him for dead in the Scrubland. And one old king, with nothing left but the memory of the ground beneath his paws, walked back across the plain and stood at the waterhole. And in the standing, in the simple refusal to disappear, he wrote the final chapter of his story. Two males took his kingdom. One old king returned to it, and in the long grass where he now rests, the savanna remembers both of them, and the wheel turns on, and the territory holds the memory of them all.